So the sampling frame that you have is incredibly important in terms of who you would like to generalize the findings to. For instance, at our college, we conduct or administer a survey of community attitudes. And all we want to know is our community aware of the college and what do they think about the college? We had no other intention for the data in mind other than assessing the effectiveness of the college. The initial sampling frame, the first time this survey was administered, came from voter registration records. Well, that might be important if we were trying to gauge opinion about the college for an upcoming election, in terms of whether or not we had a millage on the ballot. It might be important to choose the sample from voter registration records. That was not critical, though, to us the first time out. And what's important about that is if we wanted to be able to generalize to a greater population, the population of our service area, it wasn't critical to be able to generalize to the people who vote. There could be a difference among people who vote and who do not vote. Therefore, we didn't really want to limit our sampling frame to only voter registrations. So that's another example of going from a theoretical population to a sample and why it's important in every step of the way to understand where you're getting your information from, where you're getting your sample from. And if it's not as valid and reliable as you want it to be, then you have to make caveats. Sample size. How big should the sample be? Well, the nice thing in research and statistics is it depends. Your sample size depends on your research question. Just like your variables, just like your design, just like the measurement of the variables. Sample size and sampling methods depend on your research question. In qualitative research, sample size could be very different than in quantitative research. Typically in quantitative research, the larger the sample, the better, because the larger the sample, the more likely it is to represent the population. And when we use quantitative research methods, that's usually what our goal is, to try to generalize to a larger population. But there are diminishing returns with creating very large sample sizes. It could cost a lot of money. It could require tremendous amounts of resources to get a very large sample size. But you only need so many to be able to generalize to a population, and that is due to probability theory. That's due to statistics, statistical probability theory, which we'll talk about more a little bit later, and sampling methodologies. Typically, when we have sampling error, it's because our sample does not represent the population. Anytime the sample differs from the population, you're going to encounter some sampling error. If the sample is different somehow than the population, you get sampling bias. Meaning, if, for instance, in that community attitude and awareness survey that we administered, the first few times we administered that survey, our sample was predominantly older women. And that could have to do with the procedures for how the data are collected, when the data are collected. We had a random sample of people, but anytime you have a random sample of people, they could be all women. because randomness is simply about pulling a name out of a hat, a flip of a coin. We'll talk about that in a second. But our sample was not representative of the population in the college's service area because it overrepresented older women. That's called sampling bias. We can talk a little bit more about why that was the case later. There are two types of sampling methods: non-probability and probability sampling. Under non-probability sampling, that's typically what's used in qualitative research. We have four different kinds: convenience sampling, purposive sampling, quota, and snowball. Convenience sampling is essentially accidental. What group was conveniently located to be able to conduct your study? The difference between non-probability and probability has to do with randomness. Non-probability means non-random. Probability means random selection. Why it's called probability is because with certainty we can calculate how accurately the sample represents the population through probability theory and statistics. With non-probability sampling, we cannot do that. You cannot say, if you try one of these methods, convenience, purposive, quota, or snowball, that your sample represents the population. If your sample does not represent the population, then your study lacks external validity. That's one of the major weaknesses you find in qualitative research, is external validity. You're typically not going for that with qualitative research, but you are usually in quantitative research trying to create a probability sample so that you can generalize findings to a greater population. So in convenience, it's about who's available to be a part of the study. It's not representative of any population, and it usually cannot be replicated. In purposive, you're looking for people based on your research problem. Purposive means simply that the people that you choose to be part of your study were intentional. So, for instance, you could be running a study to talk about advising, or to be doing some research to talk about advising of students. And you could create a purposive sample out of school counselors or advisors at a college. You intentionally select those people to be part of the study. That's purposive. In quota sampling, you're looking at simply trying to be more representative, or sometimes not. Let's say you want to overrepresent older women in your study. You might create a cutoff point for how many of those people you want to be a part of your sample. That's creating a quota. Finally, snowball sampling can be used in qualitative research. You might start off with a few people, talking to a few individuals for your study. In snowball sampling, then, you ask those people for additional potential people to interview. And that's how you create your sample. And so on, and so on, and so on. Probability sampling is most frequently used in quantitative research. We're going to talk about four different types: simple, stratified, clustered, and systematic. The fundamental principle in probability sampling is that the sample will tend to be representative of the population from which it is selected if every member of that population has a chance of being selected. And that's what randomness is all about.